All righty. Welcome, everybody. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the history of the women's suffrage movement and the struggle to pass the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and to acknowledge the necessary role of our organization, the League of Women Voters, past, present, and future. In today's presentation, celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the League of Women Voters, we're going to offer a chronological history, but more important, a history of the lessons learned the hard way. In the process, we'll give credit to and draw inspiration from a few women who worked on our behalf. Those good women, and men too, campaigned to pass and implement good laws. They couldn't get it all done in their lifetimes. They passed the torch to future generations, to us. Petra's going to start with pivotal stories from the national front of the women's suffrage movement. Then I'm going to share anecdotes illustrating how the wider story played out in Wisconsin. Then we're going to ask the founding members of the League of Women Voters of the Northwoods, you've been clued in ahead of time, who are alive and well and with us today, well, in the Zoomosphere anyway, to share what motivated them to form our local league, how they built it up so effectively, and how they've tallied some significant accomplishments. All this will lead to the questions: why did you join the League of Women Voters? What should our league do now? And how are we going to do what we say we want to do? If Petra and I have spoken effectively, many of you will be chomping at the bit to answer those questions and contribute to our collective forward movement. So Petra, take it away.
Okay. All right, well, first, just a few things about this Zoom meeting. In the lower left corner are icons to control your audio and video. Please keep yourself muted unless and until you wish to speak. We hope you will keep your video on so that everyone can enjoy seeing each other. But you are free to turn either off or on as you like. We're planning a half-hour of discussion at the end, so please hold your questions or comments until then, and please speak rather than using the chat. That said, you are free to use the chat function, although no one is monitoring it for this meeting. So as you will come to see, the League of Women Voters emerged directly from the women's suffrage movement. The movement in the US was one of ceaseless agitation in more than 900 local, state, and national campaigns over a period of 72 years and 3 generations. Decades of patient persuasion and persistent pressure. Those who began the cause did not live to see it come to fruition, and those who did see women get the vote had not yet been born when the movement started. While our time today does not allow for a proper overview of the movement, PBS does have a new American Experience program on the subject, a 2-part series, 2 hours each. So in 4 hours, you can get a great summary of the suffrage movement, rich with images and film footage, and meet some of the more important figures. You will at least start to appreciate the endurance and the strength that continued the battle against persistent indifference and injustice. There are many good books you can read as well, not to mention the 6-volume, 6,000-page history of women's suffrage, ultimately published by Susan B. Anthony. Today, with the limited time we have, I will just tell a few stories that touch on the racism that was inherent in the country, I use the word was, and in the movement, and then also on the magnificent women's suffrage parade that took place in 1913. The first women's rights convention in the US took place in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. This event, attended by about 300 people, including Frederick Douglass, is considered the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. Pictured here are Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left and Lucretia Mott, who had organized this convention and presented a declaration of sentiments with language modeled after the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, etc. The image on the right shows this declaration of sentiments engraved in stone at the site of the convention, now a National Historic Park. The convention organizers were at least partially inspired by their familiarity with the Native Americans in New York State. They couldn't help but notice that Native American women held positions far superior to that of white women in their respective societies. They saw what female autonomy, equality, and cultural empowerment looked like in practice. Here are just a few examples of the contrasts they noted between the Native and white societies. Getting back to the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments presented there had 16 points, addressing a broad range of issues on the minds of women of the time. Point number 1 was considered the most important grievance against men. Number 1, he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. Early on, women realized that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to make progress on these issues unless and until women could vote. So in the end, this convention attracted a lot of attention, and soon there were other conventions. Okay. It's like a lot of blank space on my notes. 13 years later came the Civil War, during which suffragists turned their focus on the fight to abolish slavery. With the end of that war in 1865, the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution gave Black men the right to vote. This led to a lot of resentment in the southern states in particular, where the desire to maintain white supremacy was very strong indeed. The suffragists, largely educated, middle to upper class, white women, many living in the North and the West, resented that illiterate men, whether white or Black, had the vote, whereas they did not. So there was a distinct fear of upsetting Southern voters and officials, thereby complicating the suffrage cause. So it was very much intertwined with racism, which was increasing over time in this Jim Crow period. After the Civil War, plenty of African American women, now free, also became active in civil rights. They sort of had triple oppression: sex, race, and class. But the prevailing suffragists did not exactly welcome Black women into the fold. They remained silent on race, and so the movement excluded Black women to a great extent. As leading Black suffrage Eugenia Hope said, white women could not completely divorce themselves from their belief in segregation and racial inferiority. Afraid that might be true to a great extent today, perhaps. After the war, the suffrage movement resumed, but before long, a schism developed. One faction opposed the 15th Amendment as it was. They wanted it to grant the right to vote to women as well as to Black men. Whereas another group supported the 15th Amendment and focused on passing suffrage state by state. The result was the formation of two competing national organizations in 1869, both focused on winning the vote for women. The bifurcation of the women's suffrage movement was resolved 11 years later, when the two national organizations that existed merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, if I may call it that. Key figures in this merger were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who you remember from the very first Women's Rights Convention decades before, and Susan B. Anthony. NASA started with a membership of about 7,000 people and eventually grew to 2 million. The new organization's strategy was to push for the ratification of enough state suffrage amendments to force Congress to approve a federal amendment and to get President Woodrow Wilson's support. Whoop. As the 19th century came to a close, racism in the US became even more intense. NASA decided to permit state organizations to exclude Black women if they so choose, in an effort to appease the southern states and defer to states' rights, which in the South meant segregation, among other things. Black women's accomplishments in the movement were extensive, and yet much of it was not documented in the official history. Suffragist leaders, including Susan B. Anthony, were willing to sacrifice principle for the sake of expediency. At this point, meet the woman who would later establish the League of Women Voters, Carrie Chapman Catt, a peace activist, a skilled political strategist, and an outstanding speaker. Catt became active in women's suffrage in the 1880s. She too was a key founder of NASA. In 1900, she was elected president of NASA, filling the seat vacated by Susan B. Anthony, who was 80 years old at that time. Catt was born in Ripon, Wisconsin. But when she was 7, her family relocated to Iowa. Her interest in women's suffrage started very early when she realized that her mother didn't have the same voting rights that her father did. She later attended what is now Iowa State University, the only woman in her graduating class. And she advanced from teacher to superintendent in Mason City, Iowa. In 1885, she married newspaper editor Leo Chapman, but unfortunately he died a year later of typhoid fever. And then in 1890, she married a successful engineer, George Catt. So Catt is credited with devising the suffragist winning plan, which carefully coordinated state suffrage campaigns with the drive for a constitutional amendment, the plan which led to final victory. As you see here, Catt served as president of NASA twice over the years. From its inception, NASA had held national conventions every year, and the one in 1920 would be its last and largest. With victory so near, the focus of this convention was working out the organizational details of the League of Women Voters as a new and independent society, bringing together all the state organizations as well. The intent was to educate women on political issues. Catt served as the League's honorary president until her death in 1947. In 1923, Catt published a history titled Women's Suffrage and Politics, the Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement, which is on my book list. She also gave her attention to child labor and world peace during the rest of her life. After the horrors of World War I, she organized a committee on the cause and cure of war. Activism for peace was very big for her. And during World War II, she worked on behalf of German Jewish refugees and then died in 1947. So within a month after that last NASA convention, 35 of the necessary 36 states had ratified the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Tennessee turned out to be that last state to ratify in August of 1920, 100 years ago this month. The story of Tennessee's ratification is an amazing one, and you might recall our program last November and the wonderful book on this topic, The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss. So now let's move on to one African American woman's story. Ida B. Wells was a prominent journalist, activist, and researcher who battled sexism, racism, and violence. Ida Bell Wells was born in Mississippi into slavery during the Civil War. Her parents had become politically active during the Reconstruction era, and they had instilled in her the importance of education. Wells was only 16 when her parents, an infant brother, died of yellow fever in the epidemic that had hit her hometown. Left alone to raise her siblings, she took a job as a teacher so that she could keep the family together with help from a grandmother. Later, having moved to Memphis for better pay, Wells soon co-owned and wrote a newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. Her reporting shed light on the conditions of African Americans throughout the South. After the lynching of one of her friends, Wells started investigating, writing, and publishing a lot about lynching. A certain expose of hers in 1892 enraged the locals, and who burned her press and eventually drove her from Memphis. The threats became so bad, she was forced to move and ended up in Chicago. In 1899, Wells married a famed African-American lawyer, Ferdinand Barnett, and they had 4 children. And throughout her career, Wells balanced motherhood with her activism. She also traveled internationally, shedding light on lynching for foreign audiences. And she also was one of the co-founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I could go on and on about Ida B. Wells' accomplishments, but I'll end by mentioning that this year, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize, posthumously, of course, for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. So now on to a more uplifting topic. On March 3rd, 1913, thousands of women marched up Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., demanding the right to vote. This national procession, staged the day before Woodrow Wilson's first presidential inauguration, was the first civil rights parade in the nation's capital. The event brought women from all over the country in a show of strength and determination to obtain the ballot. Some women, such as Phoebe Hahn here, arrived exhausted after hiking 230 miles from New York City. And this, of course, attracted lots of publicity along the way. Others came by sea from countries where women already had the right to vote. This event had been meticulously coordinated. It was intended to attract the attention of onlookers, many of whom were in town for Woodrow Wilson's inauguration the following day. The parade was so successful that when President-elect arrived at Union Station that same day, the crowd was far thinner than he'd imagined. A member of his staff asked, "Where are all the people?" And the police replied, "Watching the suffrage parade." At the head of the parade was 27-year-old Inez Milholland, a well-known activist, speaker, and lawyer. She was perched on a white horse, wearing a long white cape and a golden tiara with a star of hope on top. Behind her stretched a long line with 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 other heralds, more than 20 floats, and more than 5,000 marchers. There were delegations representing each state. There were also sections that celebrated working women who were grouped by occupation and wearing appropriate garb. Here you see a delegation of nurses. When the procession reached the Treasury building, 100 women and children presented an allegorical tableau written especially for the event. Here you see an actress playing Columbia, representing strength, beauty, and liberty. The New York Times described the pageant as one of the most impressively beautiful spectacles ever staged in this country. So you remember Ida B. Wells. That's her in the middle, marching with the Illinois delegation. Sad to say, the event organizers, because of the racism we've touched on somewhat, they decided that all the Black women's groups, of which there were many, in the parade were confined to the very end of the long procession. But Ida refused to participate unless she could march under her state's banner. So she just walked up and joined the Illinois delegation. She said, either I go with you or not at all. The procession began late, but all went well for the first few blocks. However, soon the crowds, mostly men in town for the inauguration, many of them drunk, surged into the street, making it almost impossible for the marchers to pass. Women were jeered, tripped, grabbed, shoved, and otherwise assaulted. Instead of protecting the parade, the police seemed to enjoy the scene. One policeman said they should stay at home where they belonged. One witness explained that the crowd did not take the affair very seriously. And other witnesses saw ambulances come and go for 6 hours. And at the end of it, more than 100 marchers were hospitalized. The DC police did virtually nothing to help. So badly did the police fail at protecting the marchers that Congress convened a special session days later to review their actions. And the chief of police was ultimately dismissed. The day after the parade, Woodrow Wilson delivered his inaugural address, making no reference to all that happened the day before. And shortly after, the suffrage leaders met with Wilson to press him to declare his support. But his support did not come until 1918, 5 years later. So getting back to Inez Milholland, who led the parade on horseback, she unfortunately died 3 years after that parade at the age of 30. She was on a long speaking tour during which she gave nearly 50 speeches about women's rights, sometimes fainting from anemia and exhaustion. And in October of 1916, she collapsed in the middle of a speech. And this was in Los Angeles, and she later died. But her last public words were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And you see those words did not go to waste. They became a longtime fixture in front of the White House, as well as in other places of protest. And there on the right, there's me and my longtime friend Sandy, who's a very active member of the League of Women Voters of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And last fall, she and I were in the Adirondacks and we visited Inez Milholland's grave in Lewis, New York, where her family had their estate. They were very well off. So, in conclusion, we celebrate the great accomplishment of these women by standing in our own power. And as you're all aware, the 19th Amendment did not break down voting barriers for all women, nor for all men. Even to this day, barriers to voting are being erected nationwide to disenfranchise people based on their socioeconomic status, race, or other arbitrary factor. Many Americans still don't have their voices heard in choosing our representatives. Politicians have robbed voters of their power by tactics such as manipulating access to the polls and gerrymandering districts at all levels of government. The League of Women Voters believes that all eligible citizens should be able to cast a vote confidently proudly and without additional requirements that prevent them from voting. It is clear to us that the fight remains unfinished. And with that, I will go ahead and turn things back to Dorothy.
Okay. And testing here. Can everybody see that screen? Am I
Nope.
sharing the right screen?
Do you have the slides pulled up, Dorothy? Ah.
There, you got it?
Yes.
Okay. And let's see if I can advance these as I want to. No. All right, yes, I can. All right. Thanks, Petra. Now, on to Wisconsin. The women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin, like the national movement, had plenty of powerful personalities, bitter differences over tactics, and a long string of disappointing failures before the 19th Amendment finally became law. Just as Peter recommended you watch the PBS American Experience series, The Vote, I recommend you watch the Centennial video produced by the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. You can find it on the State League's website. I have the page there with an arrow right to the little blue words that you click on to see that video. The stories I'm going to share came from Genevieve McBride's book on Wisconsin women. Dr. McBride is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she teaches women's history. I became aware of her by attending her keynote address at one of our State League's recent annual meetings. At that meeting, she also gave a memorable luncheon talk that some of us were fortunate enough to attend in the good old in-person days. Most of the slides you'll see in my presentation came from the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Their chief archivist said they're fine with the use of their historic photographs in nonprofit educational programs, and I'm grateful for their permission and for all the work of the Wisconsin Historical Society in general. My assignment tonight is to tell the story of Wisconsin's women's suffrage movement and the origin of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. To do that, I've invited a few guests to join us. We're all here in the two-dimensional zone of Zoom. Those of us in attendance in real time traveled virtually through space. Our honored guests have traveled through time. We see them in this gallery view because photography had been invented when they were alive. And I'll introduce them to you individually as I tell their stories. Alas, we don't have any live video or audio from them, just their selfies and some action shots. Furthermore, they won't be able to speak for themselves. Their microphones are muted. Fortunately, Dr. McBride gives them a voice in her book. Her sources are primarily newspaper articles written about or by these major figures in Wisconsin women's history. Where does their story begin? In the 1820s and 30s, settlers from two white American subcultures flowed into parts of the Michigan Territory that would become Wisconsin. The end of the Black Hawk Wars and the opening of the Erie Canal brought Eastern Yankees to the Lake Michigan southwestern shore that would become the southeastern part of Wisconsin. These Easterners brought with them their moral baggage of abolition, temperance, and to some extent, women's rights. In the 1940, or yeah, excuse me, I've got that wrong there. In the 1846 and 1848 constitutional caucuses held in the Michigan Territory in preparation for Wisconsin statehood. And remember, 1848, the year when Wisconsin became a state, was also the year of the Seneca Falls Convention. These caucuses were composed of what was considered some of the ablest men of the territory. One attendee at the first caucus raised the specter of female suffrage for comic relief, and as an attempt to show how preposterous were the proposals to grant women and freed slaves the right to vote. Edward G. Ryan, who you see there on the right, a vocal and esteemed caucus delegate from Milwaukee, declared that women's property rights would destroy the character of the wife and were contrary to the usages and customs of society and the expressed commands of the Bible. These proposals were handily defeated, as was the proposal to grant property rights to married women. This precedent was perpetuated for over 70 years. And Edward G. Ryan, no relation to Paul Ryan as near as I could tell, went on to thwart women further in his role as Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. When the Civil War came, Wisconsin women took over the farms and their husbands left to soldier. They filled vacancies in city offices and were even admitted reluctantly into a few trades. Teaching and other professions were open to women, and Carroll College became the first college in Wisconsin to admit women in 1863. What about after the Civil War? Well, the women who had deferred their pursuit of women's rights until slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment expected that men who dominated the reform movement would join them to work for women's suffrage. In accordance with this, the American Equal Rights Association was formed. This organization welcomed men and women, but the men dominated the leadership. The Reverend Olympia Brown, who you see pictured here, was one of the first women ministers in Wisconsin and was one of the featured speakers at the AERA's first meeting in 1866 in New York City, along with the better known luminaries Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Lucy Stone. But Olympia Brown of Wisconsin was the only one of these first generation women's suffrage advocates who lived long enough to vote 5 decades later. She was as determined and persistent as she looks in her photos. She was a young woman when she set off to win the vote for women. She was an old woman when the goal was achieved. In 1869, after the 14th Amendment became law, Stanton and Anthony founded the more militant National Women's Suffrage Association for a federal amendment campaign to enfranchise women. Within months, Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell founded the more conservative American Women's Suffrage Association for state-by-state campaigns. Not for the first time, nor the last, women's suffragists split over apparently opposing strategies to achieve the same end. Reverend Olympia Brown was a force behind the scenes in the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association for decades. She, like other key Wisconsin suffragists, was a transplant from New England. She had a personal history that explains her motivation. The elders in her church in Connecticut, in which she served as a minister, had decided they preferred a gentleman preacher when she got married and gave birth to her first child. She searched for a new church, and in 1878, she was called by a Universalist congregation in Racine. In the late 1860s, Wisconsin suffragists were getting better organized along the same lines as their sisters in other states. The first statewide suffrage convention was in 1869. The call came from Milwaukee, which was then a comparative mecca for women in the professions. Dr. Laura Ross Wolcott, here on the left, would soon be the president of the Wisconsin Women Suffrage Association. That organization would survive for more than 50 years until the 19th Amendment was finally won. Dr. Wolcott was the first woman physician in the city and one of the first in the country. She, like Reverend Olympia Brown, had a strong personal motivation. She was denied admission to the Milwaukee Medical Society for more than a decade. She and the other women pictured here, Lavinia Goodell, fought for wider causes even as they struggled to be officially recognized in their professions. Despite a push from the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, the legislature could not even be persuaded to pass school suffrage. In other words, letting women vote for school offices. Meanwhile, by 1873, suffragists in Wisconsin, like those across the country, had strayed into the cause of temperance. A notable woman in Wisconsin's temperance movement was Janesville's Lavinia Goodell, a self-educated lawyer who became the bane of liquor dealers in courtrooms across Wisconsin. She was finally admitted to the Rock County Bar, but was refused admission to the state bar. When she appealed to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, then Justice Edward G. Ryan, a longtime foe of women's rights, the one who kept Wisconsin's state constitution from granting women the right to vote, ruled against her, stating in his opinion for the court that a woman lawyer violated natural law, and that the law of nature destined and qualifies the female sex for bearing and nurture of children of our race and for the custody of the home. Despite the efforts of Lavinia Goodell and the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union activists, temperance ran aground in Wisconsin. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which made prohibition the law of the land, turned out to be, if you ask me, a counterproductive and temporary sidetrack that diverted energy from women's suffrage and powered up its opponents. Staunch, powerful resistance to temperance came from the brewing industry, which was Milwaukee's leading economic engine. Talk about the prevailing power of moneyed interests, but also from rural farmers for whom hops was a lucrative crop. And the hostilities of these powerful interests towards the temperance campaigners spread to the suffragists, who were often the same women. Meanwhile, Wisconsin suffragists lacked an effective organization, and in spite of a variety of tactics, still failed to get the legislature to pass legislation to extend the vote to women. The crushing setbacks regarding limited school suffrage, adverse decisions of the Supreme Court, defeat of other measures before the state legislature almost eradicated the suffrage movement for the rest of the century in our state. But then Ada James and the second generation took up the suffrage cause in Wisconsin and throughout the country. Ada James was the daughter of a woman suffragist and a WCTU leader from Richland Center. She seems to me to be Wisconsin's counterpart to Alice Paul. The only Wisconsin native to ever rise to the leadership of our state suffrage movement was Theodora Winton, who was raised in reform politics, again, a second generation suffragist. Her parents came west before the Civil War from upstate New York to Waukesha County. Theodora, their first child, was born in a log cabin in Ashippun in 1863, but raised in Prospect Hill, a crossroads between Waukesha and Milwaukee. Her mother a school teacher, taught Theodora to read and write, while her father, Theodore Sumner Winton, tutored his namesake in politics. Theodora pursued further formal education and was valedictorian of her graduating class of 5 at the state's first college, Carroll College. Well before her marriage to the publisher of the Waukesha Freeman, Winton was hired in her own right at the paper, which had long been influential in Wisconsin politics and the press. And there is Theodora Winton Yeomans. In 1886, Theodora Yeomans won her first byline at the Freeman for wielding, quote, wielding the pen in a very pleasing manner in accounts of her journeyings across the state alone. It was a series that hinted at her independent nature because she even traversed the Northwoods alone. By 1888, readers' response convinced the Freeman to make Winton's column a regular feature. Although atypical in her access to power, Theodora Winton Yeomans was typical of many women of her time and place in turning to the women's club movement as a route to reform and political influence. The press, after all, could only editorialize for reform. Club women were accomplishing it, although at first just for themselves, self-improvement. But the self-improvement clubs gained confidence to change popular notions of women's place. After the formation of the Wisconsin Federation of Women's Clubs, the state organization would be responsible for political campaigns regarding public schools, prisons, domestic science, and inevitably headed a campaign for school suffrage. Again, that's just a limited suffrage allowing women to vote in elections pertaining to public schools. Wisconsin was transformed by the club movement's most popular project, their beloved free libraries. Chris Wendt, you're smiling and nodding, yeah. Lucian E. Stewart, a Milwaukee clubwoman, helped to organize a Wisconsin Library Association in 1894 and draft legislation which created the Wisconsin Free Library Commission in 1895. By 1896, the number of libraries in Wisconsin had doubled since just 3 years preceding. Increasingly, the clubs also cooperated for instructional skills in the public sphere. 2 clubs co-sponsored a women's lawyer lecture entitled Laws of Wisconsin Affecting Women as Wives, Mothers, and Property Owners. Club women elsewhere also cooperated in campaigns to improve their towns and cities and to improve their organizational skills. This was facilitated by their joining the nationwide General Federation of Women's Clubs, which was organized in 1890. The club woman's catchphrase, municipal housekeeping, made their campaigns more palatable at the time. Unlike earlier suffragists, enraged by the injustice of being denied the ballot, club women would come to suffrage because they became vexed by the inefficiency of working without the vote. Milwaukee was selected as the site of the General Federation of Women's Clubs' 10th anniversary convention in 1900. And Theodora Yeomans, who was a member, covered the event for the Freeman newspaper and was also chair of the convention's press relations committee. Yeomans wrote with admiration of how far women had come, literally and figuratively, in coming to women's conventions. Remember, it was a big deal for women to even travel back then. But there was a racist caveat. Wisconsin had its own version of the events that Petra talked about. In July of 1899, in other words, just before this convention was about to be held, Yeomans reported a revealing interview with an officer of the Alabama State Federation vacationing in Waukesha. This delegation member intimated that Southern women were organizing to make a stand for segregation. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs had been formed by this woman, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, an editor of the Black Weekly Boston Current in the 1890s and founder of the Women's Era magazine, by which means she intended organizing the colored women of the country to do work uplifting their race. Ruffin was a member of both Black and mixed race women's clubs in Boston and New England. But due to pressure from the Southern white women's clubs, the General Federation turned Ruffin away at the door of the elegant Pfister Hotel in Milwaukee. Her credentials were accepted, but Ruffin was denied the routine courtesy of representing all her clubs. After the convention, women club members quickly got over the racial huff and got back to their previous agendas. But women's suffrage went nowhere in the state legislature in the last decade of the 1800s. In 1911 and 12, there was a heroic and creative but futile attempt to pass a statewide suffrage referendum by these second generation suffragists like Ada James. And here they are working every which way. The boats, the cars, the 4th of July floats, the back rooms. Tactics they utilized included auto tours, showering pamphlets from an airship at the state fair, a dramatic entry in the state fair's floral contest, soapbox speeches on street corners, and petition drives. And of course, the surviving first generation suffragist, the amazing Olympia Brown of Racine, continued her persistent efforts. But on election day in 1912, the statewide referendum in support of women's suffrage lost again, with 63% voting in opposition. In Wisconsin, as a matter of fact, pretty much all efforts to achieve women's suffrage through the state legislative acts fell flat until the last minute in 1920. Between 1899 and 1915, there were no fewer than 21 attempts in the state Senate and Assembly to enfranchise women in various ways, but each attempt failed. As an afternote, if you can believe it, the Wisconsin state constitution was not ratified to grant women's suffrage until 1934. Yeah, 1934. The New York State referendum, in contrast to Wisconsin's, brought forth a lot of effort from Carrie Cadden. Although that referendum also lost, it was a chance for General Carrie Chapman Catt and her flying squadrons of suffragists to practice what became some very effective tactics. And even though the referendum lost, on the next day, they had a fundraising campaign and raised $100,000 for a new campaign. And the end of the New York campaign freed up Carrie Chapman Catt to resume the reins at NASA, the National Association, National American Women's Suffrage Association. And Carrie Catman Chat sought a working board of women with ability, independent needs, and connections to power. In other words, women like herself. Cat and Yeomans were remarkably alike in many ways. Both were Wisconsin natives, women journalists, and early leaders in the women's clubs. The two were even more alike in management style. And as one historian wrote, by this point, the day of the amateur reformer had given way to the professional organizer. Yeoman's approval of Cat's winning plan was a foregone conclusion when Cat called her and other professional organizers to a secret meeting in the in the Washington, D.C. headquarters in January of 1916. National board members and state presidents signed pledges to submit to national direction to concentrate effort on the federal amendment, no longer the state-by-state thing. Throughout the summer of 1916, Yeomans continued to encourage parades and other diversionary tactics. She called for local suffrage associations to participate in the 4th of July parade, and there she is in one carrying the Wisconsin banner. And on the national scene, Cat and Alice Paul staged that massive parade on the day before Wilson's inaugural, and Peter told us those details. But then history intervened with two additional huge impediments. World War I, followed by the 1918 influenza pandemic. Do those photos seem like they could pertain right today? And influenza and related pneumonia debilitated but seriously affected over 100,000 Wisconsin residents. That's when the state's population was about 2.5 million. Compare that to our current COVID-19 statistics. 100,000 for the flu. We're currently at 60,000 for COVID-19 in Wisconsin. Population then was 2.5 million, and now it's 5.8 million. So that influenza pandemic was devastating. And let's hope ours isn't quite that bad. In May of 1919, the winning plan worked and Wilson capitulated. He called on Congress to come back for a special session, and the 19th Amendment passed Congress. But remember, then it had to be ratified by the states. Well, Wisconsin, that had always been foot dragging, and Jack and Johnny lately decided to try to be the first to ratify. And this was a scheme of the women's suffragists, in particular, Theodora Yeomans. She said that we of Wisconsin have been extremely ambitious to secure for our state the honor of being the first state to ratify, but other states have similar ambitions. And she slyly singled out Illinois as having set its heart on being the first, which was fighting words to awaken the competitive spirit of any Wisconsinite. So they scrambled around, had a special courier that took it to Washington, D.C. It was David James, Ada James' father, and got it there first. And the rest of the story, as Petra mentioned, is told wonderfully in Elaine Weiss's book, The Woman's Hour. So that the 19th Amendment finally became part of the Constitution in August 26th of 1920. And in anticipation of follow-up tasks, Carrie Chapman Catt formed the League of Women Voters of the United States. That was 6 months before the amendment was ratified. And likewise, Wisconsin, that same year, before the amendment was passed, created the Wisconsin League of Women Voters. This is the picture of Senator David James getting Wisconsin's ratification in there first. And here's a group portrait of the First League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. And Jessie Jack Hooper of Oshkosh, the first president. In her subsequent role as a pensive historian, Theodore Winton Yeomans wrote, quote, "The careless world will probably continue to think that women's suffrage just happened, that it was in the air. But we know that the changes in opinions of society which made it possible were the results of ceaseless, unremitting toil. The women who finally achieved numbers sufficient to win suffrage, if not to overcome prejudice, was a significant factor," Yeomans wrote. However, more crucial were the few women in the first fight, from the very beginning. Political equality of women came because a little group of women had the profound conviction that the enfranchisement of women was so fundamentally right and so absolutely necessary that it must be brought about. It was that burning flame in the souls of a few women which lighted and led the way. So saith Theodore Winton Yeomans. So now, audience members, it's your turn to speak. We're going to turn off the mutes in order to hear why you joined the League of Women Voters, what you think our league should do now. How should we do it? In other words, what is your hope for the league in the next 100 years?
This is Karen, and I just want to say, Petra and Dorothy, you outdid yourselves. This was amazing. What a wonderful documentation of the history of the league and of Wisconsin. And I was struck by that slide with Carrie Chapman Catt's list of issues at the Seneca Convention, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're the same issues we're dealing with now: reproductive rights and voting. And I mean, maybe not child labor, but it's like nothing's changed. Ah.
Thank you, Karen. Yes.
Hey, I just want to say, go Kamala Harris.
Yeah. We'll get a woman president in there one way or another.
What I was thinking during the whole presentation was, it took a couple hundred years of hard work by a whole lot of people to get to Kamala Harris. I mean, without everything that you guys talked about, she never would have got where she is today.
You did a wonderful job with that presentation. I really appreciated it. And I particularly enjoyed the references to Carroll College, Wisconsin's pioneer college, founded in 1846. Had I known you were going to feature Carroll College, I would have had my Carroll College coffee cup handy. And the other connection was when you talked about the women's clubs and their promotion of the public library movement in Rhinelander. The Women's Club was founded less than a year before the Rhinelander Public Library was brought into being, and that was their very first project. And they continued to be the founding mothers and the supporters for the Rhinelander, what is now the Rhinelander District Library, and continue to this very day. So our fates were inextricably entwined. And I remember doing some research on this when I was still a director. And somewhere I read that the women's clubs were a convenient camouflage for the women who were interested in suffrage and a whole bunch of other stuff. But if they could talk about the women's club and about, we're going to go and discuss the domestic arts or whatever, they could foment a lot of rebellion and do a lot of good without calling undue attention to it before they were ready to reveal their plans.
I was impressed by I can't remember her name now, the attorney who went up against the liquor industry in Wisconsin. I mean, what could be braver than that? I can't think of anything.
Lavina Goodell.
Thank you.
But it seems like that whole temperance thing, as you said, really took things off track and made it difficult to move forward with the vote. And so you wonder if they hadn't aligned with the temperance movement, if it would have happened sooner.
Yeah, because the 19th Amendment was supposed to be the 18th Amendment.
Oh, okay. I think the thing that makes me really sad is one of the things is how they succumbed to the racism of the time, that was overwhelming to them, and they made those compromises, and those are the kinds of things that we're still suffering with today.
Yeah, they knew they couldn't make it without the southern states. They really had to walk that edge. It's very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also, I guess it was pretty intense from what I understand. I don't know how all of the Jim Crow and the lynchings, and it's pretty horrible. And it was I think it was just so ingrained. I think we're better off now, although I wish we were further along.
Yep. It shows how it's been hand in hand throughout history.
Yes.
You can never separate. Freedom for one is freedom for all. Justice for one is justice for all.
Yeah.
But doesn't it give you courage too, that you can't just observe things? That if you want change, you really gotta pitch in and put your life into it?
Harry Sky is very politely raising his hand. What would you like to say, sir?
Well, I think this is an amazing story of determination, longevity, and courage. And the women are to be congratulated because it was mostly the women. But I took a college course in Mideast history this last winter, and throughout the Middle East history, women have periodically come to the fore. In the Ottoman Empire, when they were off fighting, the women would take over the farms and the city governments and keep things going. And then when the men came back, they went back to their female duties. And I think it's important to realize that this country, again, is just a very small portion of the world and the female population. And all these countries are nowhere close to the 19th Amendment. And it's very important to recognize how precious this was and the determination, but there's so many women in the world that are still way behind in these efforts. And it shows in these countries. And so I think the League of Women Voters and the women's suffrage movement is a shining light for these other women around the world, not only in the Middle East, but Asia and India and so many other places, that this is a very rare thing that happened in this country.
I think that's very true, but in so many ways, when you compare us to other countries, there are many countries in the world that have had women as leaders of their country for decades. So we're a little behind as well.
Well, yeah, the examples are in Europe in particular, but it's not very universal.
Mm-mm.
And then ironically, I mean, it was the Native American populations here that inspired these women initially, that gave them the comparison, the matriarchal societies that were just seemed, that where position of women was just far superior to theirs at the time.
And when the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin formed, there was right away, there was an O'Donnell League. But all I found was one paragraph in one little newspaper clipping about that. And I'm afraid that Native American women have otherwise not been included in our movement. We've got a ways to go right there. Deb, do you want to talk a little, you and Karen, can you talk a little bit about the founding of the League of Women Voters of the Northwoods, like why you did it?
Well, so I was trying to remember today. I know it was 2012, and I wish Yo and Jane Trotter were here because they were part of the group along with Nancy Bain and some others. And I think it was an event at Nicolay that brought us all together, and we started chatting and decided we needed to do something to educate voters in the Northwoods. And so we got together in this small group, and we looked at leagues across the state, and we read their bylaws and looked at what they were doing, and we stole from everybody and created this chapter. And then we got so much help from the Wisconsin League in getting it on the ground. And in 2013, we finally got approved by the Wisconsin League. Yeah. So
I just wanted to call your attention again to the map in the last slide. Are you able to see that? It went away. Oh. Petra, can you bring that up?
Sure. Let's see. I suppose I could have done this more quick.
Yeah, I think I just.
There we go. This one here, right?
Yeah, yeah. Wanted to draw your attention to that map on the left. That is a map of important sites in the history of women's suffrage in Wisconsin and the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. And what do you notice about that map?
It's in the south.
There's a vast wasteland in the northern half of the state.
So Karen, you mentioned
It took it 2013.
Yeah, right.
Well, that doesn't mean that nothing was happening. It just means that the people that made that map weren't paying attention.
There you go. Right, right.
So Deb and Karen, do you want to say anything more about the founding of the League of Women Voters of the Northwoods? And
No, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
well,
I'm
this is a tiny active group here. This is a core group that showed up to this presentation. And remember that Theodore Winton Yeomans referred to the fact that it all started with just a real small group of women. So what would this small group of women like to see in the future of the League in this state and the League of Women Voters in the Northwoods? What would you like to have happened 100 years from now?
This is Sue, one of the newer members, and I just have a question for those that have been around, especially, our chapter here. What do you feel, or maybe you don't, I guess I'm just thinking about what are our barriers as we think about where we want to go? Because the point that was made before about that whole list that Carrie Catt had, and we're sitting with such a similar list today, that makes me frustrated just knowing that. And now I'm sitting here thinking, what are our barriers as we think about where we want to be? From those of you that have been working with much longer than me.
Well, I don't know. There's been people working much longer than I have too, but it really drills home that you can never relent on your rights, that rights can be eroded so quickly. We can't let up on any basic rights. We have to continue to fight, unfortunately, for the same things over and over and over again.
It was interesting, in the suffrage movement, everything was happening at the state level, different states, and there's just so much going on. But in some cases, women won the right to vote and then lost it. And,
Really?
yeah, and I guess it's similar to the 15th Amendment and African American men getting the right to vote. But then look what happened. I mean, they really. The southern states, a lot went on to make sure that they couldn't cast their votes. And that goes on today in different forms as we speak.
Does anyone have any statistics?
Definitely.
The voting patterns of women in this country? In other words, is the percentage increasing each election? Or is it up and down? Is there any idea as to how many women are voting, what percentage? Is there any track record on that?
One statistic is that in the election after the 19th Amendment was passed, which enfranchised 23 million women, in the next election that fall, 9 million voted. And that compares with a total of about 3 million women in the women's suffrage movement up to that time. So 23 million got the vote, 9 million exercised it. And that has been an ongoing cause of anguish. And I think that the percentage of women that vote equals the percentage of men that vote in every election, and it's not very good. And something to try to explain and maybe do something about.
Well, the group's League of Women Voters seems to be non-sexist. They're even inviting guys in, but it would seem to me that that would be a worthwhile endeavor for the League of Women Voters, is to get a higher percentage of women voting and not be so neutral, so that you can, I know you want to be neutral for certain reasons, but it seemed like it would be a worthwhile effort to maybe go in a different direction.
Well, women are not, you know, an autonomous group any more than men are, or people of color, or, you know, we're independent thinkers, and people are independent thinkers, and they're also independent non-thinkers. And that's part of our call, I think, and our challenge is how to get more people voting.
I agree.
This
Pam,
Pat,
so Pam, my problem is in the midst of COVID, how do we do this? We had such an active program in the high schools in Lakeland and Tomahawk and Rhinelander and Three Lakes and Eagle River. And now with COVID, we can't get into the schools. And so, I mean, I thought that was really important to educate and empower new voters and young voters. And now I don't see how we do that.
Does the League of Women Voters have any money to advertise on TV?
Yes, we do have money. We do have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we do have funds. We do have money, yeah.
So
But we don't really have advertising money, Deb.
Well, I mean, we
don't have buy media time money.
you know, I think that's something to explore, you know, when you look at, you know, not probably ABC, NBC, you know, the big channels, but there's a lot of cable TV that candidates buy time on. That's something we could look at. And Harry, what were you thinking? What kind of TV ads?
Well, something that would be compelling for people to vote, particularly women. Something that would inspire them, like understanding what the women's suffrage was. You got it. We gave it to you. It's your turn. Step up to the plate. Take your kid next door and
What?
go.
Wait a minute. Nobody gave anybody anything.
Well, they earned it, and then you don't want to lose it. And I don't think you will, but I think that people seem to be very passive in this country, and the voting statistics show it. It's only when you get a candidate that's really shows some pizzazz that you'll get people out. I hope Kamala Harris can do that. I think she will, but I don't think it'll be enough. I think, and there has to be a new movement that will overcome this voter suppression. So those would be the issues that I would work on, is anti-voter suppression and getting people out to vote, particularly women.
I would also like to see more women
but I think
running
League
for
of Women Voters does that.
What was that?
I would also like to see more women.
Oh, I
run-
was just saying, I think the League of Women Voters. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know who I'm interfering with, but I just would like to see more people running for office, particularly at the town board and the county board levels, school board. I mean, we've had women, a fair amount of women who've run for school board, but it seems like the county boards and the town boards could use a few more different points of view and perhaps younger points of view.
Well, and women who have
Well,
a
this is-
vote, because the town clerk and the town treasurer, they don't have a vote. So women have to, yes, that was my thought after all of this presentation. We need more we need more women who are in elected offices and have the power of the vote, the power of the agenda, committee power to bring up these issues. Yeah.
Look at the effort that some of our
Oh.
members have been doing for the, the fair maps, for instance, and the resistance that we've met in some of those town boards and the county boards. It could have been far different if we'd infiltrated a little bit before these things came to the table.
So when the Oneida
Well,
County,
I do agree that
Go ahead, Deb.
oh, I was just going to say that
this
when the Oneida County Administrative Committee yesterday voted down just the ask of bringing those two referendum just to the county, the full county board for all the board members to discuss and vote on, but they wouldn't even do that. So that was incredibly frustrating. They sit knowing that they're ensconced in their seat and nobody's going to challenge them. I don't know. But let me just touch on the high school, Karen. Until we know what's going to happen in the high schools, we can't really plan. Will Loesch and one of the Rhinelander High School students, Lisa Kennedy, have talked about what they can do. And if the school does open, they're talking about perhaps just in the libraries, putting the VRAP program and having a computer in the library, that when kids turn 18, they can come on down to the library and register to vote. And that would be, a program that could be replicated in high schools anywhere. And basically was the Milwaukee leagues. That was what they wanted. That's what they've been working towards for years, is getting a program in the libraries. And then Lisa wants to also do some registration drives before the November election. What that'll look like, we don't know, because we don't know what school will look like. So,
Well, that's good to know. So is there a pretty active core group of young members in that league in the high school?
we'll have to see who graduated and who's interested.
Okay.
And she was going to reach out to some people.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were interested in tonight's meeting, but I think what, Petra and Dorothy have, provided tonight would just be wonderful presentations to high school classes, that could just be broken down into a couple, like some of just the history of the national movement and then what happened in Wisconsin, and bringing in the whole race issue. I think that's really, really, really important, and that you did that very well. Yeah. So.
So we're going to post this on YouTube, correct? Petra?
We could. We may as well, I guess.
Yeah,
We
I think
finally have something to post.
Yeah,
Other than
I think we
the
should
actual
put it
meeting,
on
which
our
is such
YouTube.
a nail biter, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and then, so from what I've heard from teacher friends, they're doing AB days at the high school, just like every other school. Well, not every other school, but a lot of schools are doing AB days. And I have a friend who's teaching a new course on women's history. And so I'd love to have her have access to this to incorporate that into her course.
Right.
Great. That's great.
That's great. And under the umbrella that we
This is,
all are standing on other women's shoulders,
Right.
And one
yes.
thing,
In fact, the presentation is really, I mean, this presentation is very good. This is Pat. I really appreciate it. It's very informative. And to the point of how do you get people to vote, what you were talking about earlier, I'm on the county board. It is a lot of work. And it is a voice, and women's voices should be heard on there. Really, it makes a difference. But I don't think, but there's a lot of apathy around people around, like, why don't you run for office? They don't have, you just can't get people interested. So I really believe that it starts where people are working in the schools with the voter registration and with encouraging young people to have that vision, because my counterparts, forget it. They're not interested in it. They don't have the energy for it. You know what I mean? And I really think it has to start with the young people. So I think the work you're doing in the school is absolutely awesome.
Yes, Harry.
I think you have to be sneaky. And the question is, has the new superintendent of schools been lobbied for assistance? And is the principal of the Rhinelander High School and the vice assistant principal been lobbied as to whether or not they can assist, so that they make sure that their voter eligible students are registered? Can they assist in this process? Are they on board? I mean, they're your key players here. The county board is not going to help you at all. They don't give a rat's ass.
No, they have been, Harry.
Well,
you know, to more or less degree, they have been. Yeah.
But the principal is in the school.
Right, right.
And fires need to be set on their chairs. But they would be the ones who would extraordinarily be assistive. And I don't know anything about it, but I want to make sure you've tapped those resources.
Oh, you're absolutely true. But right now, they're drowning in trying to figure out how to get kids in school safely. I mean, they've got parents on one side saying, don't send my kid to school. They got parents on the other side saying, get my kids back to school. They're trying to figure out how to coordinate the classrooms, the ventilation systems. I mean, they're beside themselves right now. So I think voting rights, although you're absolutely correct, is the least of their worries right now.
Well, you got time, and
right.
It can be, things are going to become clear soon. And even if it's done remotely, teachers can help you in their classrooms.
Yep.
Don't forget to vote, guys.
Right.
Right.
So it's very interesting that the Brennan Center did a presentation, a webinar a month or so ago on a report from the Knight Foundation that I shared with the board. And they looked at like 100 million Americans who are non-voters. And they looked at what are the reasons for them not voting. And they saw that there wasn't much of a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the young, we know the young don't vote like middle-aged and older do, but the sexes, there wasn't that much of a difference, nor the socioeconomic class. And so it was interesting that their perspective is that people don't vote because a lot of them, because they don't understand what's going to happen when they get to the poll. And that embarrassment of not knowing is a barrier. And the other is that they don't trust in the election system and the security of the election system. And so they had recommendations for working with municipal clerks, county clerks, to try and get them to be the voices of what to expect and how, absentee balloting works, or in-person early voting works, and describe the security of our voting system. So we're hoping to do some of that after this election today.
You guys, I gotta cut out. So thanks
Okay.
again for the program.
Thank you, Chris.
See you
Yep.
later.
Thanks for coming.
All right. So, yeah. So those were some of the things that I've learned about that are barriers that we can work on, but we're open to all ideas. Yeah. And then the other barrier that Petra, I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, about working with the websites for the.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting. So Jackie Cody did a survey or an audit or whatever you want to call of the voter information, the information that voters need on the town, the municipal websites. And it's incredible how much information that should be there is not there. So we've already got a little group going to try to address that, certainly as soon as possible, so we can have a positive impact on the November election. I did some calling today, the Wisconsin Elections Commission and some of the other associations, and there doesn't seem to be any standards, but I think common sense is a good standard. Like, you should tell people where their polling place is and what the, what the constraints are and that kind of thing. So it looks like, well, I spoke with Deb and I've been speaking with Jackie, and we're trying to hook Sue here into this. But we're going to go after this and try to fix, because this is, to me, I wasn't looking for anything else to do because I feel like I'm still out of balance. But to me, seeing that, I was so incredibly blown away that, I mean, I think back to the time when when we first moved up here 9 years ago, and, we have now media, a lot of it's internet. It's not like, years ago we could go to a newspaper or a phone book and find what we needed. It was more simple. And it was hard to know what was what around here. People, I think the municipal websites, county websites, whatever, need to have the information that voters need. So it's not rocket science. So I'm hoping that if we can put pressure on these town clerks to nicely, ask them to please, we notice these things are missing. Could you please? I mean, I'm just talking, we haven't gotten together. There's probably other tactics and things, but why not bring this up as a League of Women Voters? Please make this stuff available to your citizens. This is not hard. And why should they get away with that, really? To not, we have one town that doesn't even have a website. That's Monaco. So where do people go for the information? That's not right.
Right.
So that's low-hanging fruit, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
So
this is exactly what we can be working on.
Right.
Because ultimately those, besides just the kinds of things that are happening in the community at large that help people see the importance of their vote, and it's their biggest voice that can be heard, we have to do what we can to have the information available. And that's where young people and people who aren't voting and people who are moving to this area are going to find the information they need to get registered and to get voting.
That's what we're paying our taxes for. They owe this to us, the citizens. They should be, this is not hard.
Yeah, and
it's our best effort.
Yeah, and the other area that we could work is that when Jackie Cody talked to about 100 voters, not knowing their leanings, and as many times as they want a person who cares about them in election, 25% of them had moved to the Northwoods and found candidate information scarce other than the party line. About 40% of those calls, people want information about the candidates. I was asking them choose one of the other candidates in the 34th, 12th, 7th districts. But instead of talking about the candidate, she goes, let's go to a neutral site. And she took them to Vote 411 in the candidates guides. And oh boy, were they impressed. First reaction when one candidate answered and the other didn't was, I like the candidate that respected me as a voter enough to answer. And that was some that was all some needed to determine their choice. Others read and commented that the quality of the question helped them understand the candidate values. To a person, they appreciated having an unbiased site so they could make up their own mind. So that's another barrier, and the work on that candidate guide is, I think, really important. And we had a lot more hits in the Northwoods in the spring election than we've ever had before. So, yeah.
And we know we have candidates who can't be bothered submitting. They're quite confident in their victory. Maybe we can change that.
Right. Right.
But
Well,
oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, to keep thinking about how many years it took. So we're playing the long game. That's all. It's the long game. That's all. Yeah. Go ahead, Petra.
So we need to push Vote 411, really publicize it and get people using it.
Yeah.
I know that I did the same thing in Newbold for the town supervisors. There was one who did not provide responses, and so he was out, in my mind.
Have you partnered with a newspaper or the television station to let people know that there's this 411 out there? Are they adverse to that, or?
They've been very good. That's how we did so well. We had lots of press releases.
Yeah. And WXPR featured, Yo did a piece on WXPR, which was excellent.
Yeah.
So we should promote that on our homepage, on our website, and on we should keep hammering it.
I think, the main thing is we need to keep doing what we're doing. We can't lose heart, even in this time of COVID. We just have to keep plugging away, because ultimately it's going to be the basics that are going to get the job done. It's going to be, people have to have confidence in the Vote 411. We have to have contacts at the high schools so that they know who to contact, when they want to talk to us, when they have time. Like you were saying, Karen, we just need to let them know we're here and who to contact, so that they have a name, a person, email, contact information, and we just have to keep plugging away at the basics and including more and more people in that process, because all of us burn out and need a little respite, and somebody else needs to stand up and pick up the torch. And then after we've had some respite, we can pick it up again, as we have all done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Keep going. We can do it.
Yes, we can. All right.
And Harry, I really appreciate you being here tonight and offering your suggestions. And we have this recording, and I don't know if anybody actually made a list of to-do things that we can work on, but I think we should go back over this recording or the discussion and look at all the suggestions that Harry and so many other people had about how to move forward.
Yeah.
I think if you can find key people whose job is it to provide information at their place, such as the school, and enlist their help, then you don't have to do all the work. That's why I say you have to be sneaky. Get them to do the work.
Well, we do send a letter to all of the school districts, twice a year at the beginning of each semester, to the district administrator, asking that they send our letter and our pamphlet, reminding them to register to vote if they're new to the area. There's been a name change, an address change, just check their vote. And then we give them the dates of the upcoming election. So we do that. And then we also say, And if you can send it to your seniors, we would be appreciative. And we do that to Nicolay College. What's that?
Here's where it goes.
Well, they're emails, so the equivalent. You know, you think it's the easiest thing to do to send to an administrator?
No,
Give it to you and just send it out.
You got to talk to them. You got to show.
Oh, well, yeah, well.
Build relationships.
Yep, you're right about that.
Make them feel guilty.
Well, I think the other thing we need, that I know we're working on a strategy, but as we start talking about all these great ideas and everything that's out there, and I heard the burnout factor in that, it feels like as part of our strategy, we need a communication plan with timelines that, you know, you repeat it over and over. So this quarter every year, these are the ones we're going to contact. You know, these are, to Harry's point, you know, as school kicks, we're going to jump in there and go meet with them face to face once a year. Those types of things, because I think if that goes into our strategic plan, we can share who's doing that. Same person doesn't have to do it every year. But I think those are things that will probably help us to keep the sustainability, because otherwise it kind of becomes the flavor of the month. I mean, we've all been there, and right now everybody's talking about voting. But 6 months from now, nobody may be talking about it, or, you know, they'll be talking about what happened. But, you know, that's when we need to keep it in there and keep it alive, especially with these younger people, so that it's not just something they think about every 4 years.
Yeah, I'm hearing interest in involving the next generation, the high school students in particular, and we know that there's inevitable turnover in the high school. So I'm hearing from Sue and from Harry that we ought to have a spreadsheet, a checklist, one of Jackie Cody's spreadsheets, where we identify who the key administrators and teachers are each year and get their contact information, and renew the relationships or make new relationships as there is turnover in the administration and the faculty and the students.
Well, I would venture to say too, to take that even further, and our radio stations, our newspapers, you know, TVs, any community groups, develop that same strategy for those that we feel are key ones, so that we're touching base with them throughout the year as well. I think we have an opportunity to maybe really try to get that strategy together. And if it's written down in Love Jackie's spreadsheet, that, you know, then we're able to stay on top of that and keep after it all the time.
And if we have our basic scripts, our basic media pieces, we can adapt those, whether we're talking to a high school class or the WXPR or the TV station or the local newspaper, or individual groups that invite us in. But I like your idea, Sue, of identifying who, and Harry, identifying who the key contacts are, the positions of people that we need to make sure that we're up to date on, and build those relationships and maintain them.
We have a strategic planning session that's coming up, and I think we need to get in that thinking of action plan, you know, of really laying it out, and then assigning who's going to do what. You know, I mean, it really takes that kind of nitty gritty, so that nobody has the overwhelming responsibility, because it's just not going to happen. I mean, you know, we're retired folks in the Northwoods, and committed to our community, but we can't do all the work, you know, one-on-one. We all just need to take a little chunk and do it.
Yeah, we've talked about bite-sized responsibilities and bite-sized tasks all along, but Pam, I really like the idea that you brought up at the last board meeting, and it's very simple and it's not new, but for each board member or each member of the voter services committee or the membership committee or whatever, to pick 5 people to call. We've got contact information on our members and friends, And I agree with Harry, there's no substitute for phone calls and personal contacts, although Harry knows
Personal
as well as-
contact.
Yeah.
Right. And that's same with those key people at the high schools, you know, we need to figure out who they are and then assign a person to be in contact with them, you know. If I'm going to be in contact with the assistant principal at Lakeland Union High School, then that's my assignment.
Yeah.
All right, well, this has been a good discussion. I appreciate your ideas and your active participation, and I'm delighted that we didn't put you to sleep.
It was a great presentation and a good discussion. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
So
both.
That's
thanks
great.
everybody for attending. It's 8:15 and we do try to be prompt. So I'll say bye all, thanks again. And we'll see you next time. And be thinking also about ways that we can make more and more use, better and better use of the Zoomosphere.
How about voter registrations? Virtual.
Yeah.
Hey,
Actually, it could probably be easier because you use computers. You can share screens, you know.
Mhm.
But I have a couple of young people who are interested in making YouTube videos and could show kids what to expect when they come to the polls. That there'll be a bunch of old ladies there and they'll ask their name.
Believe me, we're trying, Harry. We're trying.
You can't find any theater people?
Randy Rainbow?
Yeah.
Well,
We're trying.
somebody has to have a grandkid in high school that can be bribed.
Yeah, they're
That's-
on mine are all on the other side of the country, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, we have a big problem right now, this pandemic, don't we? Ugh.
Hey, I love you guys. I'm out of here.
All righty. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Good night. Take care of yourselves. Be safe.